Getting evicted, or bounced, as the inmates called it, was a common occurrence in Section F. I, too, would eventually get evicted to Section A in August 2013, my last month at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center before being released on bail. Before my eviction in August 2013, I had seen many inmates evicted, either because they were considered undesirable by other inmates, because they were caught in a wrongdoing, or because their safety was now suddenly in jeopardy, and they were consequently in need of protection. Lester, an inmate of Polish descent, arrested for robbing a store while drunk, was an example of the latter after his bloody fight with an Aboriginal inmate named Leaf, who was convicted of manslaughter but had stayed at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center until his release because no other provincial jail in Ontario wanted him due to his violent criminal history and difficult past in several jails. The physical altercation was over an unpaid debt owed to Lester. Brown, another inmate with a Lebanese mother and an Anglo-Canadian father, was an example of an undesirable who was evicted twice after bothering and bullying everyone in our section. None of the other inmates in the other sections of the jail wanted Brown either, and consequently the inmates in my section had to take him back again, but eventually he was evicted again shortly thereafter. Paulo, an inmate of Portuguese origin, was an example of the inmates who were evicted for wrongdoing. Paulo was on parole after he had served most of his federal prison sentence, but was rearrested after he was accused of breaching his conditions for release. After speaking with him, I realized he was suffering from mental health problems and subsequently could not always control himself in what he did. He tended to overact to other people's comments and actions. When the guards came to escort him back to the federal prison to finish his sentence, Paulo reacted negatively. He took out his penis and told the female guard to suck my dick, bitch. I was on the payphone at the time, and I could not believe my eyes. Suddenly, out of nowhere, 4 guards tackled Paulo onto the floor before they dragged him away. I could now say that I have seen everything in jail. After Salim was evicted, I assumed the role of buying chocolate, cookies, and potato chips for the less fortunate among us. In exchange, I received thank-you gifts like dream catchers from the Aboriginal inmates, spiritual artifacts which consist of a circular hoop made of plastic or wood woven with string like a net, designed to filter out all bad dreams and only allow good thoughts to enter our minds, crucifixes made from soap from the Christian inmates, artwork by some very talented inmates, and numerous personal stories from inmates about their difficult lives and their cultural origins. Then there was Chancel, a black man in his mid-20s that towered 2.13 meters, 7 feet high, and who had immigrated to Ottawa from the Democratic Republic of the Congo about a decade earlier. He was bilingual, but preferred to speak French even though he had studied at the American School of Kinshasa. Unfortunately, he had become addicted to crack cocaine immediately after his arrival in Ottawa and consequently has been in trouble with the law ever since, mostly for his aggressive panhandling in the city's downtown streets, but also for petty theft. There was Andre, an older French-Canadian in his late 50s who was arrested again because of his lustful Aboriginal girlfriend who would often sleep with other men to satiate her hunger for sex. There was Miguel, a homeless indigenous immigrant from El Salvador in his 30s battling alcoholism. He came to Ottawa when he was a child to escape military recruitment after his parents were killed during the Salvadoran Civil War in the 1980s. The Civil War was a conflict between the military-led government of El Salvador under the dictatorship of Carlos Humberto Romero and the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, a coalition of 5 left-wing communist guerrilla groups which attempted a coup d'etat on October 15, 1979, to oppose the government and right-wing paramilitary forces. The Civil War in El Salvador lasted for more than 12 years and saw extreme violence from both sides. Between 1980 and 1992, over 75,000 civilians died at the hands of the government forces during the Civil War in El Salvador. Death squad killings and disappearances remained steady throughout the early 1990s, as well as torture, false imprisonment and attacks on civilians by the Army and security forces. In 1990, the UN began peace negotiations, and on January 16, 1992, a final agreement, the Chapultepec Peace Agreement, was signed in Mexico City, formally ending the conflict, but not before over 1 million people had been displaced out of a population of 5,389,000. About 40% of the homes of newly displaced people were completely destroyed, and another 25% were in need of major repairs. On March 20, 1993, 5 days after the UN Truth Commission report was released, the Salvadoran Legislative Assembly adopted a comprehensive amnesty law that protected all military and guerrilla forces from prosecution for human rights abuses committed during the war, despite the fact that the Civil War resulted in the displacement of large portions of the rural populace and many peasants fled. Some 20,000 resided in crude refugee centers on the Honduran border in conditions of poverty, starvation, and disease. In its efforts to defeat the insurgency, the Salvadoran armed forces, financed by the U.S. government, carried out a scorched earth strategy, adopting tactics similar to those being employed by the counterinsurgency in neighboring Guatemala, which were primarily taught by American military advisors and adapted from the U.S.'s strategy during the Vietnam War. Another inmate in my section was also from Central America. But unlike Miguel, Antonio was spared tragedy in his native country of Guatemala. Antonio was arrested for violating his parole conditions after his early release from the federal penitentiary about 9 months earlier. His rearrest was not surprising to me, since I knew from personal experience that the parole system in Ontario does not work and was even designed to fail the released inmate. Except for one of the inmates on my floor at the Kingston Penitentiary, everyone returned to finish their sentences in prison due to parole violations. Antonio was bitterly angry that he was arrested, since he claimed that the accusation was baseless and simply an excuse to keep him imprisoned despite not having violated his conditions for 9 months. He had another 9 months left in his sentence. While Antonio was waiting to be sent back to federal prison, we talked during our time in the common room. He was a slender man of average North American height and in his 50s. He was intelligent, well-spoken in English and Spanish, but quiet and reserved. Antonio remembered me while we were in prison together in Section C in November 2013, but I did not remember him. He was glad that I was on my way to being exonerated, because he never thought that I was the person being described by the prosecutor and the media. Antonio told me that what happened to me and my children was fate, and that it was destined to happen. Our destiny, he rightfully claimed, is determined at the time of our conception in our mother's womb. Even if we can travel back in time to try and change particular events, this would not change our ultimate destiny. I noticed in the science fiction movies and books that I have read and seen, like The Terminator or Back to the Future, that the only thing that changing history through time travel does is delay the inevitable. I have grown to believe that we do not choose our destiny, and that it is not under our control, but rather that of a higher entity. Traveling back in time, if it was possible, to pay Lien's extortion demands instead of summoning her to court for the divorce would have delayed our inevitable fate by possibly a year, but at least that would have been one additional year for the children and I to be together. After Jihad's transfer to the rehabilitation facility, my new cellmate, Hunter, joined Antonio and I in our conversations, since he was seeking information on how and where to enter Mexico by land after his planned prison escape. Hunter's ultimate destination was Brazil, which has a long history of rejecting requests to extradite criminals and suspected criminals to other countries. Antonio advised Hunter to enter Mexico through the border crossing in Nogales, Arizona, since there was no border guards and no officials to request identification. As a white Anglo-Saxon, Hunter would not have any problems blending in with all the other white Americans crossing into Mexico and back into the United States, which also lacked border guards on its side of the border. He warned that the Mexican city of Nogales is ridden with violence and gang activity, which has managed to creep into the American side due to the ongoing fight for control of drug trafficking routes along the U.S.-Mexico border. Hunter was unfazed by the violence and drug trafficking. He was determined to escape prison in Canada, cross into the United States, and make his way to Mexico, where he would buy a car to drive towards Panama, buy some guns, and make his way to Brazil, where he would be safe and free to live his life the way he wanted. Antonio, I, and a couple of other inmates that had heard Hunter's plan to escape prison did not take him seriously. Nobody believed that he would carry out his plan, since it was not the sort of thing that people in Canada did. What most inmates did not realize was that Hunter was no ordinary Canadian. He was a young man in his mid-20s who loved his guns and other hunting weapons, with a long criminal record and a history of defying authority. During our conversations together in our cell, Hunter told me that he was arrested on December 31, 2010, in the west side of the city for numerous weapons offenses: careless handling of a firearm, possession of a dangerous weapon, a knife, carrying a concealed weapon, pepper spray, unauthorized possession of a firearm, uttering threats, trespassing at night, dangerous driving, and impaired driving. He led police on a wild police chase while driving his all-terrain vehicle, but later abandoned the vehicle after he collided it into a fence, then continued fleeing police on foot, but was eventually caught by police dogs. This was not his first arrest, and in fact he has been in trouble with the law since adolescence due to his addiction to alcohol and due to his previously undiagnosed bipolar disorder, which was finally diagnosed in January 2010. He had spent nearly 2 years at Harvest House, Christian-based nonprofit rehabilitation center for young male drug and alcohol addicts under the age of 31, but without success, primarily because of his undiagnosed bipolar disorder. Hunter was waiting to go to trial at the Ottawa courthouse in January 2013 to determine his fate. He would eventually be sentenced to 2 years' prison by Judge Julianne Parfait, but he also had similar charges on the Quebec side of the Ottawa River. In addition to going to court in Ottawa, he had to go to court in West Quebec. It was during his scheduled court date in Quebec that he planned on executing his escape plan. Hunter was a very intelligent young man who had started his studies in engineering at university. He was crafty, innovative, perceptive, ingenious, brilliant, persistent, and bold with an active mind. He was a real-life MacGyver, a fictional secret agent played by Richard Dean Anderson in the American television series that aired from 1985 to 1992, who used his knowledge of the physical sciences to make things out of ordinary objects to solve complex problems. I had witnessed Hunter make handcuff keys and all sorts of other gadgets to help him plan his escape, gadgets which he hid up his rectum so that the guards would not find them. Aside from this determined man who planned to escape imprisonment, I got to know some of the other aspects of his personality and his life. He told me that he was the grandson of an Army veteran who served in the Korean conflict and that he himself loved to hunt animals. He also loved Arnold Schwarzenegger and claimed that he had never rendered a bad performance in any of his movies. I beg to differ. Schwarzenegger's performance as the villainous Mr. Freeze in the 1997 movie Batman and Robin was definitely a disaster, but Hunter disagreed with me. Hunter did a good impersonation of Arnold and drew him regularly, and quite well, in his famous role as the Terminator. Hunter had just ended his relationship with a young woman named Dana, and from what he was telling me, Dana either didn't get the message or did not want to get the message, and was doing everything possible to hold on to him despite that Hunter was exploring potential relationships with other women. Hunter educated me on the mentalities and activities of the young women of his generation, like the bush parties, a party held in a wooded area, usually around a campfire and laden with alcohol and narcotic drugs, and naked attendees like his friend Catherine. The promiscuous sex among his peers and the manner in which many young women trapped young men into a relationship by becoming pregnant with their child. It was really alarming to hear them from first-hand experiences, even though I had already read about these events and had seen them on television. I found it equally disturbing during my time at the Kingston Penitentiary to hear that young men also would intentionally impregnate young women to trap them into a relationship in order to use them for some other purpose, for example, to get citizenship or to get money from the women and or her family if they were wealthy. Hunter had been in and out of jail himself and had been sent back and forth from our current section in the jail and the segregation unit for numerous offenses outside and inside the detention center. Hunter knew all the guards at the detention center by name, and they all knew him, too. He knew their personal stories simply by socializing with them and by eavesdropping into their conversations with other guards. Hunter had even begun assigning nicknames to the guards based on their character and their resemblance to fictional and non-fictional characters in Hollywood movies, video games, and history. Ray Liotta, President Bush Sr., Barack Obama, Sergeant Stryker, etc., etc. Many of the guards were annoyed by Hunter, whom they found to be troublesome, and retaliated by alternating his meals from regular to vegetarian to halal. Hunter never complained if he was fed. He particularly enjoyed the high-protein meals since it helped him build his muscle mass. He became obsessed with being physically fit by eating lots of protein, lifting crudely made exercise weights from magazines wrapped in an orange T-shirt, and jogging around the common area every day. To me, most of the guards all began to look alike in their pale blue shirts and dark blue pants. The supervisors wore white shirts and thus called a white shirt by the inmates to differentiate the blue shirts from a white shirt. There were only about 10 jail guards that stood out from the pack. Douglas the dictator, who insisted that we fix our beds after breakfast, the heavy-set French guard from Quebec with white hair and mustache, another dark-haired French guard from Quebec as evident from his strong support of Montreal's hockey team, which he read daily in his Journal de Montreal newspaper. He mostly worked in admissions and discharge section. He was the first guard that I encountered at the detention center back in June 2008, the stocky brunette female guard who loves to ride motorcycles, the blonde white female guard who was plain-looking but tried to impress everyone with her fluency in other languages. She was the guard who escorted me to the detention center in Lindsay in December 2010, a white female nerd-looking guard who was married to another guard of Iranian descent, the female guard of Aboriginal descent who was always calm and polite, the friendly female blonde guard of French descent who wore too much perfume, the white slender female guard with dark hair whom Salim obsessed about because of her tight ass, and the slender female guard with dark hair and a large nose whom all the other inmates found attractive despite her temper. The rumor around the jail was that she used to work as a naked exotic dancer and granted sexual favors to the men who asked her nicely. My father came to visit me once a month at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. He said that he was glad that I was back in Ottawa since it became increasingly tiring to drive to Kingston to see me. The Kingston Penitentiary was 203 kilometers or 126 miles away from his apartment on Alta Vista Drive, while the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center was only 7 kilometers or 4.5 miles away. I had told him that I was going to replace my lawyers since I did not see any progress with my bail hearing. They had not even come to see me to give me an update. This had really upset me, since my former attorney, Vincent Clifford, did the exact same thing with me, leave me in jail for several months at a time without seeing me or giving me an update. Back in 2008, when I was detained after my arrest, waiting to be released on bail. My father staunchly told me not to fire them because they are exceptionally good lawyers. He told me, "Don't fire them. They are Jewish. The Jews are just like the Greeks." I looked at him through the glass partition and told him through the telephone receiver, "Wonderful. My lawyers are assholes." "No," my father shouted back through the telephone receiver, "they are not assholes. They are palikaria." Palikaria is the Greek word used to describe masculine men who possess great physical and mental strength, stamina, and resilience. I asked him, "If they are palikaria, Then why have they not come to see me since my return to Ottawa from the Kingston Penitentiary? He left without answering me. The following week, the guard informed me that I had a visitor. The guard had escorted me to the visiting room without partitions reserved for professionals like lawyers and social workers. I did not know who was coming to see me and thought that maybe it was the social workers from the Children's Aid Society. After waiting by myself in the visiting room for a short time, the guard opened the door to allow a white man of average height with brown shoulder-length hair and a full but neatly trimmed beard. He was dressed in a designer dark-colored suit and had his sunglasses on. He forgot his regular prescription glasses in his luxury car. I saw from his car keys on the table that it was a Cadillac. After he shook my hand and sat down, he asked me, "Do you know who I am?" I shook my head no. "I am your lawyer, Mott Weber," he replied. "I own a reputable law firm in the city. I am certain that you have heard many great things about me and my partners and associates from the other inmates," he said somewhat smugly as he shook his hair from side to side like the worldly famous Italian model Fabio. Weber looked partially like a motorcycle rider and partially like a wealthy, fashionable businessman. This was unsurprising, since he was both a motorcycle enthusiast who played the guitar and a hard-working professional who genuinely cared more about people than he cared about money. Weber began talking about himself, saying that he had graduated from law school in Toronto in 1992, then moved to Ottawa to start a law firm with other partners in 2004. He has since built a reputation as a stern and effective defense attorney while helping his partners transform their law firm into the largest criminal law firm in Ottawa. He has successfully represented Stacey Bonds, the black woman who was arrested for public intoxication and then placed in a holding cell after a police officer had cut off her blouse and bra. Richard Trudell, who was finally freed after he spent 15 years in prison for shooting and killing a married couple despite lost evidence, unreliable witnesses, and violations of his constitutional rights during his trial, and Mohammed Harkat, a high-profile case in the national media about a man suspected of terrorism by federal prosecutors that was now taking place in front of the Supreme Court. One of the lawyers at his firm successfully defended Sidney Cranham. Police had forced him to go into the cold waters of the river to retrieve a drug syringe and needle that the police needed to prosecute him, and Robert Crevier, who was arbitrarily detained after police had placed him into their cruiser and searched his belongings without advising him why he was being arrested or allowing him the right to speak to a lawyer. Matt Weber strongly maintained that he is not friends with any of the prosecutors and that he is always on the side of his clients, even those who could not afford a lawyer and had to seek financial assistance from the Ontario government, who only pays lawyers 1/3 of their market rate. He also developed a strong, good reputation of defending people who were mistreated by police who were indifferent about their constitutional rights. There is a cultural thinking within the Ottawa Police that the Constitution is a barrier to law enforcement. After my long meeting with Matthew Weber, I felt more comfortable having him as my defense attorney, and now I was willing to wait a little longer for him and Howard Krongold to prepare for my bail hearing. After he left the visitor's room, the guard had escorted me back to my cell, where my cellmate Hunter was writing and drawing in his small plan book. Hunter knew a lot of inmates, and many knew him as well. I had asked him what had happened to Cowboy, a farmer who I had met at the Regional Detention Center in January 2011, who was waiting to go to trial on allegations that he was a senior member of the notorious Hells Angels gang and engaged in trafficking cocaine. Cowboy refused to plead guilty to criminal charges of conspiracy, possessing property for the benefit of a criminal organization, and possession of cocaine for the purpose of trafficking. After 2 years of trying to get a fair trial, something that he claimed was constantly jeopardized by the conduct of the police, Cowboy requested the guards at the detention center to keep him in quiet environments to cope with the stress of trying to ensure that he get a fair trial in court. he succeeded in having a recorded interview that he was forced to give to the police after his arrest thrown out from the prosecutor's evidence after he was able to prove that 16 minutes of the police interrogation was cut out from the recording. It was the reason why he insisted that he be given a different can of soda to drink after he finished each can. Despite his modest success, prosecutor Bill Boutsouvis, a Canadian of Greek descent, still pressed forward to prosecute him even after the fact that he was shot during a home invasion by drug traffickers in 2007 and had his barn burned down. To make matters worse, the father of 7 children lost his 500-acre or 202 hectares farm, a herd of cattle, and his home during his lengthy battle with prosecutors who sold everything for $50,000. After hearing all of this about Cowboy, I now understood why he wanted to stay in a quiet area of the jail. If I was him, I too would get tired of hearing the same annoying song being played loudly on the radio about a man who is going shopping at a thrift shop for a fur coat and only has $20 in his pocket. I would find out a year later from local media that Cowboy finally had his criminal charges dropped due to insufficient evidence 3 months before he was scheduled to go to trial. Meanwhile, he had 2 teeth knocked out while detained at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center that was not properly treated and developed a serious infection as a result. The infection shut down his pancreas and consequently he was hospitalized for a week. In the 4 years of his legal ordeal, Cowboy lost everything and was not reimbursed the $50,000 made from the sale of his property and possessions. Hunter also told me about his previous cellmate, a man in his 50s named John from Parry Sound, 431 kilometers or 268 miles northwest of Ottawa, who shot and killed his daughter-in-law in her home in Deep River to spare his son and his grandchildren from a divorce that was being prolonged due to her battle for child custody and control over the family's money. His daughter-in-law had started a romantic relationship with another man. John's defense attorney, Lawrence Greenspan, argued he had a mental health disorder and had asked the jury, composed of 5 men and 7 women, to acquit him of murder and instead find him not criminally responsible. But on April 3, 2013, the jury rejected the defense's argument after 3 hours of deliberation in a Pembroke courtroom that was presided by Judge Julianne Parfait. The jury convicted him of premeditated murder, which comes with an automatic life sentence with no eligibility of parole for 25 years. Hunter told me that despite the guilty verdict, John was seen by many inmates as a hero who had made a huge sacrifice for the benefit of his family. Unconvincing. Although I remained unconvinced by his claim, Hunter did convince me of one thing. He was going to be free from prison soon. His court date in Quebec had finally arrived. On the evening of his court date in Quebec, Hunter did not return to the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center as usual. Those of us who knew about his plans to escape began to wonder if he really succeeded. Those thoughts quickly ended when Hunter was returned to my cell in the early hours of the morning with a black eye. Despite his failed attempt to escape and his eventual return to the Ottawa Detention Center, Hunter was thrilled. He recounted how his escape plan nearly worked. While he was in the paddy wagon on his way to the courthouse, he managed to use his improvised key to open and remove his handcuffs and ankle shackles. He was in the paddy wagon with another inmate who did not oppose or obstruct Hunter from his attempted escape. When the police officers had opened the doors to the paddy wagon, Hunter ran out and began running as fast as he could to the road where some cars were parked. He almost made it, but was suddenly caught by one of the police officers. Hunter responded by punching the officer in the face, breaking free of his grip, and running further away. After he was tackled to the ground by another officer, Hunter continued to fight him while the onlookers cheered. He was able to grab the officer's gun, which had fallen on the ground during the struggle, and then proceeded to aim the gun at the officer, who he allowed to step away and escape. But his response was met with more guns aimed at him from the other police officers. Hunter surrendered and was taken to the holding cell in the basement of the courthouse while being beaten by the officers who cursed him in French. He was never brought before the judge, nor was he charged with fleeing police custody or assaulting a police officer. Hunter believed that it was because doing so would have made the Quebec police officers look like incompetence. Embarrassment. After he had returned to the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center, he noted that he received a lot of attention from the female guards, whom he said was flirting with him. The male guards kept a closer eye on him and would eventually place him through the metal detector several days later and kept him in the segregation unit when the metal detector that Hunter sat on indicated that he had metal objects up his rectum. It was the last time that I saw Hunter at the detention center. Several months later, I would receive letters from him while I was released on bail to seek advice, but also to cheer me on and congratulate me on my acquittal. My next cellmate was a guy in his late 20s named Elias. He was a Lebanese Christian, but everyone said that he looked Jewish, mostly because of his nose and ears. Elias used his Jewish resemblance to his benefit. He claimed that he was Jewish and demanded that he be fed a kosher meal, which is the best meal an inmate can be fed in the province of Ontario. Generally speaking, inmates who claimed Jewish descent and were actively practicing Judaism had better meals and access to additional benefits that were unavailable to non-Jewish inmates, such as access to cellular phones. Elias knew this, and to him it was worth deceiving everyone to get these perks and benefits. He admitted to me that he almost got caught in his deception when the rabbi came and asked him if he had everything he needed to pray, including a tefillin. That is, phylacteries, a set of small cubic leather boxes, painted black, containing scrolls of parchment inscribed with verses from the Torah. The phylacteries are tied to the head and arm with leather straps dyed black and worn during weekday morning prayers. The Torah commands that they should be worn to serve as a sign and remembrance that God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. Elias did not know what they were, but assured the rabbi that he had received them from the other rabbi at the detention center in Lindsay. Although Elias received the best quality food available at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center, he was still not satisfied. He wanted more food and began bartering with other inmates to get more food into his stomach. He told me that the only time that he truly ate well was when he was in jail. When he was outside of jail, his time and effort was consumed by his drug addiction. It was the reason why he got arrested. He did not come from a broken home or an impoverished family. His family owned and operated a successful bakery in the city that also did well with their out-of-city orders, like those from Montreal. Elias knew Cash, and in fact most inmates that were involved with street narcotics at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center knew Cash, including Jihad and Brown. Elias told me that Cash and his brothers were bullies at school and in their neighborhood, and that they sold drugs. After Elias was released from the detention center, a Somalian man in his late 20s named Fuji, short for refugee, became my new cellmate. He was a tall but soft-spoken and articulate man who played chess well when he was not drowsy from taking his prescription medication. I found it hard to believe that he was serving a federal sentence in an Ontario prison. He had to return to the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center for another criminal charge. He was summoned to go to trial again in Ottawa, but it looked like he was going to be acquitted based on the defense that was going to be presented by his lawyer, Anne London Weinstein, wife of Lawrence Weinstein. Fuji could tell from the softness of my hands that I was not a murderer or even a violent person. He told me that although my hands were large, I had a soft hand grip like a little girl. He suggested that I call my book Capital Authority to reflect the authoritarian nature of Canada's capital. I told him that it was a great title, but I needed time to think about it. Fuji was born and raised as a Muslim, and although he was eating a halal diet, he was not strict in his Islamic practices. He admitted to me that his ex-wife and mother of his child, who was born and raised Christian but had converted to Islam, was more Muslim than he was. Still, Fuji fasted for the holy Muslim holiday of Ramadan along with the other Muslim inmates in our section. In fact, he was transferred to the jail cell immediately below me so that he could fast with the other Somalian. It was during Ramadan that the Muslims got luxurious foods like dates and various cheeses. In general, the Muslims got better cheese than the rest of us. I would often trade some of my meals or buy chocolate, cookies, and potato chips from the store to trade for the cheeses that the Muslims received with their meals. One of the Muslims that I bought my cheeses from was a Moroccan in his mid-20s who was arrested for impaired driving, causing death on a Sunday morning in March 2013 after he had left the casino on the Quebec side of the Ottawa River. The car crash, which caused the death of a 54-year-old woman returning from work, occurred on Innes Road, 24 kilometers, about 15 miles east from my home, and only 17 kilometers, 10.5 miles, east of the Ottawa Carleton Detention Centre. Although he did not have a criminal record before his arrest by police, he had 5 previous driving violations, including speeding and a previous crash in March 2008. He was waiting to get released on bail, which he eventually did a few months after his arrest. While he waited for bail, everyone made fun of his Moroccan surname, which sounded like the English phrase, "Who the fuck?" When one of the jail guards arrived at the entrance of the common room of Section F to escort him to his visit from his African girlfriend, he would announce out loud, "Who the fuck has a visitor?" The inmates would yell back, "We don't know who the fuck has a visitor." "You're the one who came in here asking us who the fuck has a visitor. Tell us who the fuck has a visitor." Similarly, a guard would arrive at the door and yell aloud, "Who the fuck has Friday Muslim prayer?" Again, the inmates yelled back to the guard, "We don't know who the fuck has Muslim prayer. You're the one who came in here asking us who the fuck has Muslim prayer. Tell us who the fuck has Muslim prayer." Even among the inmates, it was common to hear, "Who the fuck is in the shower? Who the fuck is on the phone? Who the fuck is in court?" The Moroccan inmate was already used to people mocking his surname. He was a confident young man with movie star good looks who was well-spoken and fluent in English, European French, and Moroccan Arabic. He was a high school dropout who attended the same school as Cash and knew him fairly well, who aspired to be a musician and a Hollywood actor. His family were friends with Ryan Gosling and his family in Cornwall, Ontario, 103 kilometers or 63.7 miles southwest of Ottawa, and the plan was to have Who the Fuck get into Hollywood. We had told him that if he ever got to become a Hollywood actor, he would have to change his surname so that they could mention his name on television and radio. He would also have to treat his alcohol addiction, especially since it was getting him into serious legal trouble and conflicted with the practices of his Islamic faith. He took offense about our comments regarding his drinking and his Islamic faith and replied that even we Christians should not be engaging in sinful activities and that we are not perfect. Some of the inmates counter-argued that, unlike Muslims, we acknowledge and accept our imperfections and thus are humbler and seek forgiveness for our transgressions. Muslims, we argued, always seem to present themselves as perfect humans that are overly strict and unforgiving. The Moroccan did not respond to our counter-arguments. He knew that we were right, especially since he still craved to drink alcohol while in the detention center and was actively seeking inmates to purchase jail-made brew. About a year later, the Moroccan was in the local news. He pled guilty to impaired driving, causing death and breaching his bail conditions by consuming alcohol on Christmas Eve 2013 and then again in the following July. He tried to remove his electronic monitoring device to avoid being caught drinking while released on bail, but failed. He was ultimately sentenced to 4 years and 9 months in federal prison. At his sentencing hearing, he apologized to the family of the woman he caused to die from his drunk driving and promised to teach others about the consequences of drinking and driving after he is released from prison. My next cellmate was an Aboriginal man in his 50s. He was from the Akwesasne Mohawk Reserve on Cornwall Island, located in the St. Lawrence River directly south of the city of Cornwall and straddling the Canada-United States border as well as the Quebec-Ontario border. He was about 1.71 meters, 5 feet and 5 inches in height, very quiet and reserved. He spent most of his time reading, doing crossword puzzles, and making dream catchers. Mohawk was arrested for assaulting his estranged wife, whom he told me was taller, heavier, and more violent than him. He told me that his wife loved to drink alcohol, and she loved to flirt with men in person by flashing her vagina — she never wore panties — and via the internet. He had caught her one time in the early morning hours of the night naked, masturbating in front of their internet camera for a man located immediately across the U.S. border in northern New York State. He told me that she never really put a lot of effort into her role as a wife or as a mother to their 2 children, a son and a daughter, and that she had made her job at the local radio station, her passion for drinking and sexual exploits, her priorities. After he had caught her in front of the internet camera masturbating, he had filed for divorce and custody of their young adolescent son, whom she never fully bonded with. Their daughter had already grown into a young adult. Mohawk's wife did not respond well to him having filed for divorce and assaulted him while he was sleeping in their living room. He did not have any other place to stay since all his money was spent on the family expenses. Mohawk was arrested and charged with assault for fending off his wife's assault. He told me that this was a common occurrence in the Mohawk community in and around the reserve on Cornwall Island. He acknowledged that there were not any shelters for men escaping violence from their wives, and as a result they had to either still stay at home with their wives or stay on the street. If they did not have anywhere else to go, I empathized with him and told him my story. He could not believe his ears and was astonished both by the refusal of the police to help me and my children from their mother and her lover, and by how the jury convicted me of murder after defending myself and my daughter. Mohawk generously made me a dream catcher to make my nightmares go away while I slept. Before he was released, he wished me good luck and told me where to find him if I needed anything. I reciprocated his kindness and wished him well with his divorce. Mohawk was not the only Aboriginal inmate in Section F. There was another man in his 50s who also sat quietly at one of the tables watching television and reading the newspaper. After my conversation with my friend Rena on the payphone, I had asked him if he knew anything about what had happened to the members of his Aboriginal tribe who lived in the Ottawa area back in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries after the Europeans arrived on their territory. Rena believes that many of the Aboriginals living in the area at that time were slaughtered by the Europeans and buried without proper burials. It is the reason why Rena feels that the Ottawa region is cursed by angry spirits. The quiet, soft-spoken inmate responded that it is quite possible that this is what had happened. He said that these type of events are never recorded in history, and that if these events happened, they are only told and retold by mouth from one generation to the next. Unfortunately, he did not know his grandparents and consequently missed out on these types of important stories. About a couple of months after we had this conversation, we read in the newspaper that human skeletal bones were discovered buried deep in the ground downtown on Queen Street at the corner of Metcalfe Street, literally 230 meters or 0.1 miles south from Canada's Parliament. The bones of 12 human bodies were discovered by construction workers who were replacing the city's old water pipes in preparation for the new light rail transit system called the Confederation Line. A couple of months later, more bones were discovered in 2 different locations further east of the Firth site along Queen Street. Archaeologists who studied the bones confirmed that they came from the early 19th century. The responsibility of studying the bones was given to the Ontario government for further investigation. My Aboriginal friend was released from the detention center shortly after the release of this news. The next time that I saw him was when I was on my way to a doctor's appointment 6 months later. He was panhandling with his friend on Bank Street near the corner of Spark Street. I recognized him immediately and greeted him. He told his friend that I am a good, gentle, and generous man who fed him cookies and chocolate every week when we were in jail together. He told me that he was happy that I was released from jail and wished me luck with my trial. Before we parted ways, he asked me if I could help a fellow brother and give him some spare change. He thanked me after I gave him $5 in coins. It was all that I had in my wallet. I did not mind. I knew that he and his friend needed the money more than I did. It was the reason why I gave him the $5. It was the reason why I bought him and the other inmates cookies and chocolate at the detention center. Everybody knew it, but there still were some who preferred to steal the chocolate, cookies, and potato chips from other inmates. There was one incident where an inmate had stolen another inmate's purchases and consequently had angered one of the female guards, the hot-tempered brunette with the large nose, who had threatened to punish all of us if the terms were not returned to their rightful owner. The inmate in question neither admitted to stealing the items nor did he return them anonymously, since he had already eaten them. To avoid being punished, several inmates voluntarily gave some of their own items to the inmate who was robbed. Johnny, one of the cleaners of Irish origin, had afterwards announced to all the inmates that there was no need to steal since Angelus would gladly buy anything that an inmate needed from the store. It was the reputation that I had developed during my 7-month stay at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. The other cleaner, Biker Boy, did not say anything, but then again he was dazed and confused half of the time since he was medicated on methadone, a prescribed narcotic used to treat his addiction to morphine. He was a 31-year-old Anglo-Saxon arrested for stealing a bicycle that the police had placed on the street to trap him. Biker Boy took the bait and stole the bicycle, which, unbeknownst to him, had a defective chain. To replace the bicycle he was riding himself at that instant. Entrapment. Biker Boy, a career criminal, was also charged with possessing marijuana for the purposes of selling. He was witnessed the week before, handing another person marijuana in Chinatown. He told me that he had more than the reported 4.9 grams of marijuana on him, but the police took most of it for themselves, which was a common occurrence in Ottawa. When I was still waiting at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center to be released on bail, I had befriended another Aboriginal inmate, an Ojibwe named Little Otter. He was waiting to be sentenced after a jury found him guilty of murdering one of his 2 roommates, 31 years old, in May 2009 for having sexual relationship with a 15-year-old girl. Little Otter was represented in court by defense attorney Anne London Weinstein. The jury heard that it was the 3rd roommate, Little Otter's friend of 12 years, that stabbed the 31-year-old with a sword, then beat him with crutches. Little Otter testified that he lost control of himself and bludgeoned the 31-year-old with a hammer, but that it was the other roommate, an Inuit from the Northwest Territories, that caused the 31-year-old to die. The Inuit friend and roommate pled guilty to manslaughter before Little Otter's murder trial to avoid getting a murder conviction and life imprisonment. He ultimately was sentenced to 7 years of prison, but was released a little over 2 years after his time waiting at the detention center to go to trial was deducted from his 7-year sentence. He had a history of being physically and emotionally abused by his alcoholic parents and consequently spent much of his childhood in foster homes where he began consuming alcohol at 4 years old. His own children are being raised in foster homes. Cyclical. After he was sentenced to 7 years, he admitted to murdering his roommate, but this did not stop the jury from convicting Little Otter of murder. Little Otter would eventually receive the minimum eligibility period to apply for parole for a second-degree murder conviction, 10 years. One of the factors behind the minimal parole eligibility was Little Otter's horrible childhood. He was sexually abused by his father when he was 4 years old, and as a result has developed an antipathy towards sexual offenders when the victims are children. Dr. Julian Goger, the psychiatrist who testified at Little Otter's trial, believes that Little Otter perceived his 31-year-old roommate to be a child abuser and likely triggered a post-traumatic stress response which was exacerbated by his drunkenness. In addition to his childhood trauma, Little Otter was battling alcohol and cannabis addiction. Tests revealed that he has subtle brain damage, possibly from fetal alcohol syndrome. He also hit his head when he was a toddler when his mother fell on him after being hit by his abusive father. He only started counseling at 13 or 14 years old, but he never discussed his emotions with his counselor, which, according to Dr. Gojer, is unsurprising, since males are much more reluctant than females to talk about their abuse. Over time, he had developed antisocial traits, but was still able to work and take care of his younger brother. On the night of the murder, he saw the 15-year-old girl as a daughter who needed protection from a parent. Of course, the jury did not see it that way. How could they, when they are 12 Caucasians who are unable or unwilling to understand the challenges the Aboriginal population in Canada face in their lives? Despite more and more horror stories being revealed about the Aboriginal population in Canada, Anglo-Saxon and French Canadians still view and treat Canada's first inhabitants with apathy and racism. The jury never got a chance to know Little Otter, nor did they want to. If they did, like I did, they would have seen a brilliant chess player who went through a lot of hardships and even overcame some of them, yet still is able to express himself through self-taught poetry and incredibly detailed artwork, some of which I bought while we were together at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Centre. He is also a very patient and persistent Christian who is continuing his battle for true justice through the Court of Appeal. Time will tell whether he finally gets justice. When Little Otter was not drawing his artwork, he was playing card games and chess with other inmates. He usually played with Johnny, the Irish cleaner who was arrested due to his drug addiction, and Hippie, an inmate originally from Oshawa, who resembled the British rock singer Ozzy Osbourne, albeit much shorter, but was a mixture of Aboriginal, French, and Polish descent. Hippie, who was also an addict, was an artist by trade. He had graduated from art school and had even taught classes to both young children and adults. He specialized in painting portraits, but was also exceptionally talented in drawing and painting other subjects, including animals. During his stay in Ottawa, he had befriended a former inmate nicknamed Mad Dog, whom I had traded food with while we were detained in late 2008 and early 2009. Hippie told me that Mad Dog, whom he considered to be his best friend, had died of a drug overdose a few years before, but that the years that had passed did not take away the pain of losing and missing him. Hippie was finally released from jail and had moved back to Oshawa to be near his mother and his adult son, whom he had raised by himself after the mother of his son abandoned them. When Little Otter grew tired of playing cards, he played chess with whomever had the courage or the foolishness to play against him. I never played against him, since I knew from watching him play that he was unbeatable. Still, there were other inmates who played against him and lost and lost and lost again. First there was Shrek, a French-Canadian from Cornwall who was arrested for beating his wife. He was called Shrek because he looked like the green ogre in the animated movie whenever he stuck toilet paper in his ears to block out the noise in the common room. Shrek was not a good chess player. I never bothered to play with him because I saw how he played chess. He did not respect the game the way intelligent gentlemen do. He played like a barbarian. Next was the Chinese international student. He was an incredibly good player, but overly conceited and arrogant. He was arrested for sexual assault after he had bitten the penis of his gay lover. He was waiting to be deported back to China. He did not think highly of any of the other chess players because they were not Chinese. He particularly did not think highly of me when I played chess with him. He had won the first game against me while he played the white pieces and I played black. In the follow-up game, where we changed colors, I beat him after my fourth move. Checkmate. He did not foresee his loss and was extremely surprised with my victory. The look on his face was priceless. Needless to say, he never asked me to play chess with him again. In fact, it was the last time that he played chess, choosing instead to play cards with another inmate called Finney. It did not really matter that he stopped playing chess because eventually most inmates became bored playing it, especially since it was the same few people always winning. Aside from Little Otter, nobody else could beat Jonathan, a wealthy white French-Canadian who, although extremely tall and heavy, about 1.83 meters tall and 113 kilograms, 6 feet tall and easily 250 pounds, but had the face of a Cabbage Patch doll. He was arrested for choking a prostitute with his two bare hands around her neck, demanding that she refund him his $20. The incident occurred in the seedy neighborhood of Vanier on the east side of the city, where a witness called police after he saw Jonathan drag the woman out of his sport utility vehicle. The woman survived with a black eye, red marks around her neck, and several abrasions. He ultimately pled guilty to aggravated assault after waiting the equivalent of 5 years to go to trial. Another inmate who waited a long time to go to trial was the bomb maker, who happened to be the cellmate of Jonathan. His bail was revoked after he failed to comply with conditions of release and consequently was returned to custody at the detention center. The bomb maker had been previously in trouble with the law for assault and for possessing illegal firearms and ammunition. This time he was arrested for possessing explosive material for the purpose of making a bomb in his parents' West End home. His father had called police because he feared for the safety of his family. Several neighboring houses, 14 in total, had to be evacuated while experts and specialists safely transferred the bomb to the experimental farm to be destroyed. At his trial, a bomb expert testified that the crudely made bomb, triacetone triperoxide, in a plastic bottle, could have injured anyone within 25 meters or 82 feet of the blast. The homemade bomb was similar to the improvised explosives used in Afghanistan and Iraq. The bomb maker had consulted the Internet for making the bomb but did not have any intended target. He ultimately pled guilty to possessing powdered explosives and was shortly released thereafter. He was given double credit for his time waiting at the detention center to go to trial. The bomb maker was a plump, white Anglo-Saxon in his mid-20s who sat around all day in the common room reading, watching television, and playing chess. He appeared to be the third best player in our section. He rarely showered and consequently smelled very bad. He would only shower after one of us told him that he needed a shower. The showers themselves were located along the back wall in the middle of the common room. There were 2 of them, and they offered just enough privacy with their 2 walls on the front and on one of the sides, measuring about 3 feet or 1 meter high, while still allowing the jail guards to monitor those taking a shower. Most inmates at the detention center showered wearing their blue boxer underwear, but a few of them, like Finney, went fully nude. Finney was an Irish-Canadian in his mid-50s from Pickering, Ontario, about 40 kilometers or 25 miles east of Toronto. He was a professional bank robber who was finishing his jail sentence for a previous criminal conviction. He was just released from the Kingston Penitentiary and was on parole when he was rearrested by police and charged for robbing another bank. He started robbing banks in 1976 when he was still a teenager and has been in and out of jail since then. While we played the board game Scrabble together, where he always made up words to score points, he would tell me about his high-speed chase fleeing police on Highway 401 in November 2009. Highway 401 is a major highway under the jurisdiction of the province of Ontario that spans 828 kilometers, about 514.5 miles, from the city of Windsor across the border from Detroit, Michigan, to the Quebec border, 70 kilometers or 43.5 miles southwest of Montreal. Highway 401 is located 90 kilometers, about 56 miles, south of Ottawa, which is directly accessible via Highway 416. Highway 401 becomes Autoroute 20 once it meets the Quebec border on the east end of the Ontario Highway. Together with Highway 20, they form the road transportation backbone of the Quebec City-Windsor corridor, along which over half of Canada's population resides. These 2 highways are extensively used by trucks to transport food and other products to 57% of Canada's population. The part of Highway 401 that passes through Toronto is the busiest highway in the world. The police gave up chasing Finney on Highway 401 because it was too dangerous to continue pursuing him in their cars. Eventually, he was caught, convicted, and imprisoned. While in prison, he stayed out of trouble and was consequently released on parole in April 2013. That was when the police searched his belongings at the Kingston Penitentiary and found traces of a dye on his jacket, dye that a bank teller who was recently robbed had placed into the bag of money that Finney had demanded during the robbery at a bank located on Carling Avenue. When we were together at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center, he was waiting to go to trial. We would frequently be sent to the courthouse together, chained and escorted by the Ottawa police in their paddy wagon. These frequent trips were a waste of our time, since we would always return to the detention center with little or no progress with our cases. The prosecutor would always delay and postpone his trial by several months, angering Finney to the point of yelling, "Suck my dick!" to the prosecutor in court after she had told the judge that she needed more time to prepare for the case. I did not hear him curse the prosecutor, since I was in the holding cell in the basement, but my father confirmed that he saw the frustrated, white-haired bank robber in the courtroom. Needless to say, Finney's impulsive outburst in court only brought him more delays as a means of punishment. He was remanded back to the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. On our way to the courtroom from the detention center, Finney and I had met some of the other inmates from other sections of the jail. There were a couple of young men in their early 20s who were scheduled to go to court for their alleged crimes. One was a Turk, a Muslim who was married to an Afghani woman but was arrested for sexually assaulting a woman, a white single mother whom he had given marijuana and other street drugs before molesting her while she sat disoriented on his lap. He worked for a major cable company selling cable, telephone, and internet subscriptions to people. It was on one of his workdays that he entered a woman's home who was interested in subscribing to these services. He immediately befriended her, offered her drugs, and sexually molested her by suckling her breasts and rubbing her vagina underneath her clothes. He had been accused of committing similar acts numerous times against other women across Ontario, but he had always managed to escape criminal prosecution and conviction due to insufficient evidence and or unreliable witness testimony. This time, his luck had run out. The prosecutor had enough evidence to convince a judge to convict him. He was waiting to see if the prosecutor was going to succeed in convincing the judge to designate him as a long-term offender due to his repetitive targeting of women for sexual offenses. The designation automatically comes with at least 2 years in prison, followed by long-term supervision in the community for a maximum of 10 years, something that Turk was afraid of. He had fired his defense attorney, who failed to acquit him, and he was now trying to convince Anne London Weinstein, whom he found incredibly sexy and attractive despite being 30 years older than him, to defend him in court and stop the judge from designating him a long-term offender. Not many people liked Turk, who had a tattoo of the Turkish flag on his right hand. He was known throughout the detention center as a swindler, always preying on the vulnerable and fooling them into giving him their money and possessions. He was also an insensitive troublemaker, angering and provoking others for his own personal amusement. On the day that I first met him on the way to the courthouse, he was bragging about his sexual exploits and his drug-filled revelry with friends. He knew Cash and wanted to continue to party with him, even though I had told him that Cash was trying to stop his old ways of living in exchange for a calmer and more virtuous lifestyle. Turk laughed at me and said that he would never allow that to happen to Cash. He was arrogant that way. He also openly admitted to me that his psychologist diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, but he was not interested in seeking treatment. Turk loved being the center of attention, often and proudly promoting the past conquests of his Turkish and Ottoman ancestors. This angered another inmate who was from Albania, but was arrested shortly after arriving in Ottawa for shooting and killing a known drug dealer near the city's Greek Orthodox Church. The Albanian, who was summoned to court to go through the usual proceedings to commence his trial for murder, was extremely upset by Turk's insensitive remarks about how the Ottoman Empire ruled the Balkan region between 1431 and 1912, and how the Ottomans conducted numerous massacres against the Albanians who revolted against the empire over the strict control of landowners and the empire's unfair taxation system. Turk bragged about how the Albanian revolutionists lost their battle for freedom and independence and were then recruited into the Ottoman army, which came with an automatic conversion to Islam. Most of the Albanian population gradually converted to Islam from Christianity since it brought considerable advantages, including access to Ottoman trade networks and bureaucratic positions in the government. The Albanians, because of their Islamic influence, their international social divisions, and the fear that they would lose their land to the emerging Balkan states, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Greece, were the last of the Balkan peoples to desire separation from the Ottoman Empire. Albania remained a part of the Ottoman Empire until 1912, when the Albanian revolutionists finally succeeded in their fight for independence, which coincided with the invasion of the Albanian region still under the control of the Ottoman Empire by Montenegro, Serbia, and Greece, but not before many people had lost their lives. The Albanian inmate could no longer tolerate any more of Turks gloating in the Ottoman Empire's control of the Albanian people and had asked the police officers to put him in a different holding cell as far away from Turk as possible. It was the last time that I saw the Albanian, but he wished me good luck with my legal case in court. He knew who I was and that I was of Greek heritage. He had asked me if he should replace his current lawyer, Michael Smith, with Vincent Clifford, my former lawyer, and his boss, Michael Edelson. I told him, no, don't do it. Edelson and Clifford are only loyal to the Ottawa police. The Albanian, who was raised as a Muslim but did not practice it, a common occurrence in countries that have been secularized because of communist control, like the way Albania was from 1944 until 1992, thanked me for the advice and left. I had confronted Turk after the Albanian left, and I had told him that he was wrong for proudly boasting the atrocities made by the Ottoman Empire during their reign and control of Eastern and Southern Europe. I told him that my own grandparents in Greece suffered greatly because of the actions of the Ottoman Empire, and that I, too, did not appreciate his arrogant, insensitive remarks. He was startled by my forwardness and apologized, although I remained unconvinced about the sincerity of his apologies. He did not come across as a resourceful man. He tried to downplay the massacres by the Ottoman Empire by saying that it was nothing compared to what Hitler and his Nazi forces did in World War II from 1933 to 1945. Turk seemed to know a lot about Hitler and the Third Reich, stating that when Hitler was Chancellor of Germany, he was first proposed by his policy advisors an economic approach to control the European continent, but Hitler rejected the strategic economic approach because he preferred a militaristic approach. Turk admiringly pointed out that Germany's current Chancellor Angela Merkel was in essence using one of Hitler's rejected policies to control Europe, which Turk pompously admitted worked better than Hitler's military approach. Asshole. I did not like Turk, but then again it appeared that very few people genuinely liked him, not because he was Turkish, but because he was an insensitive jerk. I had only met and gotten to know two other Turkish people in my 43 years of life, the man who taught me how to read and write Greek in school in New York City, and a female classmate in my graduate program at the University of Ottawa, neither of whom were insensitive jerks. That was the last time that I saw Turk, but not before I planted seeds in his head about his need to abandon his Islamic faith in exchange for a Christian one. I knew that it was a long shot given Turk's personality, but I figured that I should try anyway, since I knew that I would not see him again, given that we were in two different sections of the detention center. In the common room of the detention center, Finney would also tell me what he knew and heard about my former attorney, Patrick McCann. He told me how one of his co-accused had hired him to defend him in court, and that on one of the days that they were in court together, Finney saw the investigating police officer wipe off the cocaine on the lapels of McCann's suit jacket. Back then, McCann was a famous lawyer who won his cases even after he was arrested on drug-related charges related to his addiction to cocaine in 1983. Now, it appears that McCann lost his winning streak. It is evident from recent newspaper articles that McCann appears to lose almost every criminal case that he works on. First, there was Ben Taylor, an 18-year-old skinny Anglo-Saxon who encountered a tall, drunk intruder and several of his friends in his apartment in the east side of the city known as Orleans, from the street, who was celebrating the Irish holiday of St. Patrick's Day in 2011. Ledoux refused to leave after Taylor told him to. Taylor used physical force to get the intruder to leave. The large-sized Ledoux responded by repeatedly punching Taylor in the head. Taylor, who was losing the fight, told a friend that was with him to call the police, then ran to the kitchen to get a knife and stabbed Scott Ledoux 7 times. Ledoux died immediately from his stab wounds before an ambulance could arrive. The jury did not agree with McCann's argument in court that Taylor was defending himself in his home against a large drunk intruder and consequently convicted Taylor of manslaughter and sentenced him to 6 years in prison. Taylor's lawyer, McCann, told reporters that he was disappointed by the jury's verdict, but that at least his client was spared life imprisonment, a sentence that automatically results from a murder conviction. McCann was not even able to convince Judge Charles Hackland for less jail time, despite the judge saying in court that he believed that a somewhat reduced sentence is warranted due to the severity of the beating that Mr. Taylor received at the time he employed the knife, and this provocation reduces the moral blameworthiness surrounding his use of the knife. Even Ledoux's parents implied that their large drunken son was mostly to blame for the tragic incident. They told Detective Rick McIntosh to tell reporters that they felt the verdict was fair and that they hold no animosity towards Taylor and his family, and that they hope that he moves on with his life and that he learns from his mistake and becomes a better person. The mistake Ledoux's family is claiming is this: under no circumstances is anyone in Canada allowed to defend himself or herself, even though the law in Canada allows it. If anyone in Canada chooses to exercise their legal right to defend themselves or their vulnerable loved ones, they are putting themselves at great risk for being convicted of criminal wrongdoing. I had always found it bizarre and even hypocritical how Canadians say that they value their legal rights in Canada, yet criticize, condemn, and even punish those who do choose to exercise their rights. It is a case of do as Canadian society says and believes, and not what the law allows you to do.